So the sort of idea of what I'm going to cover this morning is, and I'm aware that I'm maybe an hour behind you, so still this morning here, but coming into the early afternoon for you. I want to sort of go through a sort of introduction to what I mean by co-creation to start off with, and then sort of look at the increasing evidence that there is for co-creation approaches and partnership, and perhaps think about the differences between co-creation and partnership. Before thinking about how co-creation can take place around curriculum, and that could be co-creation of the curriculum and in the curriculum, and I'll describe sort of differences in those subtle different words that I'm using there, and how that opens up different possibilities of co-creation, and that will lead hopefully into thinking about the possibilities of whole class co-creation, working with a full group of students in co-creating, and how building relationships are really absolutely foundational to co-creation work. So very much hoping that we can kind of move towards thinking about the importance of relationships as a sort of starting point for co-creation, and that a lot of what I'm talking about this morning will involve thinking about changing some staff and students' mindsets to quite a degree, and so what the implications of that are. And hopefully I'll leave you with a few provocations and questions. So that's a sort of plan of what I hope to cover. It's quite ambitious, but I think hopefully I will try and talk till approximately 12, so that we have time for some questions before we get into some discussions as well. So here, if I start out with a definition of partnership in learning and teaching, and that's a common term that has really gained traction in the last 10 years. It's not a new term necessarily, and certainly not new throughout higher education, but in relation to learning and teaching, this is definitely something that's become much more talked about in the last 10 years. And this is one definition, which I will let you read for yourself. And I think a really important aspect of that definition is about participants having the opportunity to contribute equally, but not necessarily in the same ways. And so there's a sort of implication with partnership that there's a level of equality involved in it. So let's have a think about how that might relate to other related terms that we might see regularly in higher education. So other terms that we often see are co-creation. So is co-creation different from partnership? And we also see things around, well, is active learning not sort of partnership or co-creation as well? So if we take active learning first, I mean, I think if we look at definitions of active learning, they often involve students being ensuring that students are sort of becoming more involved in their learning. So often you'll see that referenced in, there's quite a lot of discussion, small group work, there might be problem solving in class. It's not necessarily about sort of physical activity in the active, it's also about the cognitive. So we can't always tell if the quiet student at the back of the class is actually passively learning, or if actually they're very active in terms of the ways that they're thinking about the material that's being presented to them. But active learning, there is a mass of literature that supports active learning, and I'll come back to that shortly. But I think there's a big difference between that and partnership, as I've just defined it, where there's this implication that students and staff would end up with a form of equality in terms of the opportunities to speak, the opportunities to make decisions, that kind of thing. And yet that then raises some discomfort often with colleagues, where there's a sense that maybe if I'm the teacher and I'm assessing your work as a student, how can that feel equal? Because in a sense, I have power over you to be making decisions about your assessed work. And so quite a lot of colleagues are a little bit nervous of the term partnership within higher education. And that's where I often use the term co-creation as a way of sort of aspiring towards partnership, but recognizing that sometimes there is that discomfort about whether you can ever reach that kind of equality that's implied. And so where I think co-creation and partnership have a lot of overlap, and I think the key characteristics that seem to have overlap is that they involve shared decision-making and negotiation. So shared decision-making over elements of curriculum, over learning and teaching decisions. And there's this sense that students are involved in negotiating aspects of their own experience at university. And I think that is quite different from active learning, which doesn't tend to talk about shared decision-making and negotiation. So you can kind of see there that it's a sort of, I've indicated it might be a sort of continuum, if you like, of slightly different forms of involvement and participation by students. So I hope that that's helpful, but I also don't want you to think that that is in any sense this is the only way to think about these terms. But that's often how I've conceptualized these the different terminology. And there is growing evidence of benefits of partnership and co-creation. And some literature talks about partnership and some talks about co-creation. So forgive me, there's a little bit of overlap in these. But in terms of partnership, in a study that I was involved in now quite some time ago, nearly 10 years ago, with colleagues in the States, we pulled together the evidence that we could find in the research literature and from our own work to show that there were really three major benefits of where staff and students work together meaningfully to design learning and teaching. And they were around engagement. So students and staff experienced enhanced motivation and learning. And as I say, that's students and staff. So these are actually outcomes shared by students and staff. We also saw greater awareness, so a greater metacognitive awareness and sense of identity. And for students, that was in terms of them learning far more about how they learn, as well as them developing a greater sense of confidence and certainty about maybe what they want to do in the future, how learning is important to them in that process, maybe having more of a sense of what they want to learn. And for staff, often the kind of questions that students might ask as part of partnership or co-creation enabled them to gain a greater awareness of why they teach in the ways that they teach and why they were making the kind of decisions that they tended to make. And then enhancement benefits were also around improved teaching and classroom experiences, experienced by both staff and students. And then sort of following that study, there was an international systematic review done a few years later, which also added in, it found some quite similar results, but also talked explicitly about students experiencing enhanced belonging, better relationships with their teachers, gaining confidence, and also an increased trust in the classroom from where they'd been involved in partnership work. The evidence continues, and what we've also seen is that in many co-creation examples and partnership examples, in fact, these ones are co-creation examples, this top one, and we also see enhanced academic performance. Where the co-creation relates to assessment, we also see a shift in a focus from students on grades to focusing more on learning, which I think is quite a significant finding. There's a sense also that students feel more valued in the process because they're getting a chance to actually be part of decision making. They get practice at working democratically. So often I think that's a really fascinating finding when we think about the kinds of graduates we're hoping to support and create, if you like, in the long run. That actually, if we want our graduates to be citizens of the world, how do they learn some of those skills, whether that's practice at working democratically, but other kind of ways that we work together collaboratively. And in a sense, co-creation is a fantastic way to enable experience of doing that. Negotiation is a very, very difficult set of skills to learn, to be able to negotiate well. And I don't think we do that well if we don't offer opportunities for that to happen within higher education. Also, colleagues from the Netherlands did studies that showed an increased relevance of learning and teaching and curriculum because students were involved in decision making about learning and teaching. And we're seeing more and more, I think, that co-creation and partnership has the potential to enable more culturally responsive and inclusive practices. And I'll dig into that a little bit more today. But I think one of the key arguments there is that if we're involving students in decision making, and if we're involving a range of students in decision making, that's one way that we can very quickly enable our classroom spaces to become more culturally responsive and to include the voices of students who might otherwise not be heard more as often or are typically underrepresented. And I'm going to sort of finish the benefits section really by kind of saying there's also some work that I collaborated with a colleague on looking at examples of co-created curriculum in Scotland, and we had results that were evidence of real transformation on the part of students through co-creation. So in this study, there were 15 different co-created courses that we examined, and without being prompted, every student that was interviewed said this was the best course I took at university. And that to me is significant. There's something going on in these co-created courses that is substantially different from what's happening elsewhere in students' university experience. We saw positive transformation in assessment performance, so that's consistent with earlier findings, and particularly from students who'd previously performed less well. So I think we're starting to move into the potential of co-creation to support bridging gaps in achievement, which we want to see, particularly for underrepresented and underperforming students. And I think significantly, a small group of students decided not to drop out of university because they were motivated to stay due to the engagement that they were experiencing through co-created curriculum and co-created courses. So to me, those are quite powerful findings, I think, in terms of us starting to think this is a growing evidence base that co-creation and partnership has the potential to really make a difference. And so that prompted me to look at a piece of work that actually was written a little while ago by Freeman et al. And these are colleagues from STEM disciplines, so science, technology, engineering, and maths. And the Freeman et al. Article is a significant one. I think it's one of the most downloaded articles, I think, in the United States. And it basically is an overview, a sort of meta study of previous studies looking at the evidence for active learning. And they find that the evidence is so strong that they make the case that they say, if this was a drug treatment, we would actually pause the control group in this trial because we would be, in a sense, it would be unethical for us to withhold this treatment. So if we interpret that in terms of active learning in the classroom, and we all know there's probably pockets within our universities where people are still doing very dry lectures with very little interaction. And we think we have this evidence. Why do we still have examples where people are not using this evidence to make sure that we are using active learning in the classroom? And I almost wanted to sort of take that further to say, could we be seen as being negligent if we don't use the up-to-date research that says there is evidence here that active learning really changes things for students and really contributes to student success in their outcomes? And I want to start us to think also that the growing evidence base for co-creation might also be implying that we might need to start to think about, are we doing enough co-creation within universities? And I would ask that of my own university as well as of the universities. Are we doing enough if the benefits are starting to be seen to be so significant for students? So it's just a bit of a provocation there, perhaps. And then George Koo, he was responsible for setting up the National Survey of Student Engagement in the United States. He made a statement that most institutions can increase student engagement. So he's talking about student engagement here rather than co-creation. But student engagement and success by more consistently using what the research shows are promising policies and effective educational activities and practices. but at too many institutions, only small numbers of students are involved. And he argues the time has come, and this is, 10 years ago, the time has come, actually more than 10 years ago, the time has come for colleges and universities to make participating in high impact practices a reality for every student. And the high impact practices that he talks about are a whole range of, it's about 12 different elements of practice that they've found to have sort of very high levels of research evidence to suggest that they contribute to success for students. And one of those is about good quality student-teacher relationships, and we will come on to that shortly. And there is a bit of an argument that actually we should start to look at the evidence for co-creation and partnership to see whether it actually meets the criteria of a high impact activity. That hasn't been done yet, but a few people are starting to argue that. But this idea that only a small number of students are involved in some of these promising activities, I think we can probably relate to that in large institutions. Often there's pockets of absolutely brilliant practice, but how do we grow that across an institution? That's quite a challenge. So related to that, in 2019, I worked with Lucy Mercer-Matson, who's a colleague from Australia, we did an investigation of UK institutional partnership schemes. And what we mean by that is it's quite common in the UK that a university would have a central scheme where they would offer some funding, which comes from a central source, but for people across the university to apply for, in order for students and staff to work together to do some kind of enhancement activity. Now, that could be in the curriculum, but a lot of the time it would also be about improvements to the university. So just to give you an example, I can think of schemes where a commuter student worked with a staff member to collaborate to do a survey of commuter students to ask them about their experiences at the university so that they could then look at improving resources and support for commuter students. So that's one example. So it doesn't have to be learning and teaching, but then in other examples, perhaps students and teachers would work on making an enhancement to the assessment methods perhaps used on a course or that sort of thing. So they range, the variations are very wide. But as I say, the consistent thing is that it would be a university-led scheme where they advertise probably that there is funding to support students and staff to work together. And what we found in that study was actually that many of these schemes, even though they're called institutional and therefore are often seen as their macro level, if you like, the number of students involved is actually quite small in many cases. So the funding is available and maybe 20 pairs of staff and students go off to do work, in which case we've only actually involved 20 students. So it's seen as a large scale scheme because it's across the university, but actually in reality, it might be quite small scale. And I should say there are one or two universities who do this on a big scale. So that's clearly, we need to acknowledge that. But one of the concerns we had about these schemes, which seem to be the sort of the main way that people talk about partnership often in the UK, is that are they inclusive? Because if you're only including one student and staff, or across a year, maybe a university might include 20 or 30 students in those funded schemes, often the students that are coming forward are those who are already very engaged. And so there were some concerns that were being raised for us about whether some of these schemes actually exacerbate privilege and inequality. So they're fantastic in terms of the outcomes for those students who are involved, and they get a real sense of partnership with the staff member that they work with. But there are some real concerns there about how open those are to all students and how much all students feel that they can apply. So that kind of was a slightly provocative to me, thinking particularly about curriculum, to think about, are there ways that we could include more students than just this sort of idea of selecting one or two or a small group of students? And so when I think about the curriculum, what that enabled myself, and one of the papers was written with a colleague, Cherie Woolmer, who's based in Canada, we kind of talked about the differences that take place with co-creation. If we think about it before a kind of program or course takes place, or whether it's during when the course takes place. So we saw co-creation of the curriculum as co-design of a program or course before it actually starts. So this is usually design that's taking place maybe before it's approved by the university. We've all got these formal approvals sort of systems. But that kind of co-design regularly often only involves a selected group of students. And there are some brilliant pieces of co-design that go on and co-creation that take place. So it's not that I'm saying that's not a good thing. What I was interested in suggesting was that we should explore what is the potential for co-creation in the curriculum. And that's because it's taking place as the course or program takes place. So it's a more dynamic process, perhaps. We might even see it as, in a sense, it's actually about how we teach. It's teaching in a more open way, perhaps, to be able to enable co-design and co-creation during a course taking place. But the difference and the bit that's interesting from an inclusive perspective is that it often involves all the students in the class or the cohort or the group, depending on how big your classes are. And that's a big issue that we'll come to in terms of size. Makes a big difference here. But we started to think this is quite interesting to have a look at. I'm sorry, these are appearing in strange order, so I'll just put them all up there. I wanted to just talk through a few examples that I think might be helpful to sort of think, what are we talking about when we talk about co-creation? So let's bring this alive and think about what that might mean. So I've got examples from a range of different places, and I'll try and give you a little description of what each of these are relatively briefly. So the first two that I've coloured differently are ones where they are co-creation of the curriculum before a course takes place. And so it's not to forget that there are some great examples there. So the first one there comes from psychology, from a colleague in Bergen in Norway. And she did a project to decolonize the design of the psychology curriculum by involving 2 or 3 students from very different cultural backgrounds and gender backgrounds. And so basically tried to include a range of students who would think differently about the idea of decolonizing the psychology curriculum. So lovely example of basically opening that up as a project that students could become involved in, and did some really nice work to kind of co-create some new elements of the psychology curriculum and to really question some of the ways that had been taught previously. At the University of Glasgow, very close to where I am here, there were some colleagues who got together to co-create a science course. So colleagues in chemistry, physics and geosciences actually realised that many of the students on their courses learn some core skills that are actually shared across those different subject areas. And so they said we should come together to think about actually creating a course that sort of supports some of that skill development, but we should do that in a co-created way. Excuse me. So they invited a student from chemistry, a student from physics, and a student from geosciences to work with a staff member from each of those subjects. And they came together and designed a course to kind of teach in the best way they could these science skills, if you like. Excuse me again. Actually, they were creating quite a small course for all the students to take. But the work that students did was so impressive and it was received so well by students that after the first year of running that course, they doubled the size of the kind of the weighting given to the course, so that it was giving credit to the importance of that skill development, but also was a really amazing kind of feedback to the students about how good the quality of the work that they did was when they co-created. So 2 nice examples of that kind of co-creation of the curriculum before a course takes place. If we then start to think about whole course co-creation, there's lots of different ways people are doing this. So colleagues at Uppsala University, just outside Stockholm in Sweden, they have something called the missing perspective. And in global environmental history, they invite the students, they leave 2 of the lecture slots free towards the end of the course, and they asked the students maybe about halfway through the course, what do you think we're missing so far? Or do you think we've been covering topics, but we've covered them from a particular perspective and we're maybe missing another really important perspective, which we should take into account? And so that enables the students to make suggestions, to put forward ideas for what they would like to see kind of making up sort of those two slots in the curriculum. And the students are also invited to kind of participate in creating some of the materials for that if they're interested. Another example from Scandinavia, some colleagues at the University College Northern Denmark do something where they co-create PowerPoints for the students. So this is an innovation course, and the colleagues said, you know, everybody actually probably has ideas about what they think innovation is before they come to this course. You know, students are not, they don't have empty brains at this point. They've got ideas that they've picked up from different places what they think innovation might be. So they created a kind of Google PowerPoint shared sort of Google Slides, if you like, that all the students have access to. And the students were invited to each put in a PowerPoint slide with either images or quotes or whatever they wanted to put in there that would give an overview of what they thought innovation was. And then during the course, at different points throughout the semester, the teachers invited the students to present their PowerPoint slide. So the students didn't know when their slides might come up. You know, the teachers maybe selected 6 slides at one point in the PowerPoint pack and said, we'd like to hear from this set of people today. And I think there were two real successes with it. One, that they said it moved away from it always being the teachers talking, and that definitely sort of, we want to hear from you. So that strong message, student ideas are important. We want to hear your ideas. But they also said something they really hadn't expected was that the attendance at class was phenomenally good compared to normal. And they said, I think it's probably because the students didn't know if their slides might come up and they would need to be there to present them. So we kind of laughed a little about that because that was not really an intended part of it. But clearly it sort of makes students take that responsibility, perhaps share that responsibility for the fact that they know that there's something they need to contribute to. Lovely example from a colleague who's now actually at Vienna University in Austria. He was at Reading University in the UK, and he's in classics, and he gives his students 6 to 8 keywords and asks them to design their own essay question. And then he meets with those students to talk through like if there's anything that needs to change. And he said he doesn't do that in a very heavy-handed way. It's usually where a student maybe needs some support with the scope of an essay. So for example, he says sometimes students will design something and there's very little literature in that area, or they're going to struggle to do something, versus another student might come up with something that's almost like a PhD topic. It's so huge. So he guides in that area, but otherwise kind of tries to give students quite a lot of freedom. And he's researched that over a number of years and shown real increase in student engagement through them designing their own essay questions, as well as a modest increase in their achievement, their performance, and because they're just much more interested and engaged to actually write about something they're more interested in. So those 6 to 8 keywords are clever, because it keeps the students on topic, but they can emphasize what they're more interested in. So quite a nice example there. At my own institution at the University of Edinburgh, we have a lovely interdisciplinary course offered through what's called the Edinburgh Futures Institute, and that's an institute that's trying to experiment with new ways of teaching and future ways of teaching. And this particular course actually tries to introduce the city to the students, and this includes different blocks of learning which students can choose what order they do them and can choose which ones they're most interested. And these blocks of learning are about different ways of thinking about the city. So for example, there's a block called Mathematical Edinburgh, and there's a block which is called Literary Edinburgh. And so you can imagine there's lots of different kind of themes within the city. I know there's one, decolonizing Edinburgh. And basically the students have to go and visit places around the city where the block will talk them through the important parts of the city that can teach them about these subjects. So I know decolonizing Edinburgh, for example, starts at the statue of somebody in one of the big squares in Edinburgh. And this was a slave owner. And so it starts the conversation about how we deal with our history. And then the bit that I think is very, very clever about this is that the students then, for their assessed work, have to create one of their own blocks about Edinburgh around something that they're interested in. So if you were maybe a keen runner, you might want to do something about running Edinburgh, and you would talk us through some of the important places that you would go in Edinburgh and what's the history of running in Edinburgh, and maybe refer to some of the kind of key things that have happened in history and the parts that plays, but it can be any topic at all of interest to the student. And then cleverly, so that sort of student created content also then potentially becomes available for future students to choose as blocks to study. So the teachers do some work to kind of look at whether any of the assessments that are handed in a particular year are, would suit and would be good enough for kind of becoming blocks for the following year of students. So a really lovely way of involving students. And then there's an example from University of Pretoria in South Africa of a colleague in human-computer interaction. And she is actually trying to teach students about participatory design. And so actually she has redesigned the whole course content with students, with the idea of the whole course being a kind of participatory design in itself. So a very clever way of kind of looking at the whole of the course with students to say, this is what we're learning about, but let's try and model this in the way that we're actually learning. Many of the examples I've explained here so far, just before I come to this last example, have been with sort of modest numbers of students. So if I take, for example, the essay questions example, Peter Krushwitz probably has somewhere between 50 and 60 students in his class. And I can imagine if you're going to check each person's individual essay question, there would be a limit to the numbers of students that you could possibly kind of do that with without it becoming cumbersome or unmanageable. And so it's really to recognize there are examples that are involving students with larger numbers, but it's I think sometimes it kind of, maybe there's a sliding scale of co-creation where maybe choice is the sort of at the far end, where if you've got a lot of students, then choice maybe becomes one way you can kind of involve students. Whether it feels co-created or not is an interesting idea. So if I give you this final example, this comes from the University of Glasgow. Apologies, a couple of examples from Glasgow. I used to work there not a little while ago. And a colleague in engineering had a class of 400 students, and he gave a choice to the class. There were 4 assessments, so 4 assignments, if you like. One of them was a poster, one of them was a laboratory report, one of them was an exam, and I'm forgetting for a moment what the 4th one was. But basically, they said, we don't really want to change those 4 assessments because they work quite well. But what we would like you to do is to vote for what weighting you would like given to each of them. So, if you're someone that really likes writing laboratory reports, maybe you want to try and emphasize that particular part of the assignments. And this is for not each student individually, it's that they vote and then the class will have the weighting set accordingly. So clearly some people are going to be voting for different things and they might not get what they hope for. But what was interesting in this was they said that the weighting changes modestly each year from doing this, as different classes vote for different kinds of things that they prefer in their assignments. But what was really outstanding was, even though that's only a small change, the students every year make a point of saying, we really appreciate that you asked us about this. And I think that is very powerful, because it's a small choice that they have. But what's coming back is students are feeling really grateful that they are involved in decision making or involved in having a say. And so there's something to me that, even though we could argue, is that really co-creation? They've had choice. They've not had huge amounts of input and decision making, but that choice is enabling those students to feel that they have more agency in their study. So I think it's an interesting example, because I do think it gets harder as the classes get bigger. I've got other examples I can share if any of you have big classes and are looking for examples. But anyway, that's a lot of examples. So let me sort of move on, if I may, aware of time. So co-creation of the curriculum, it involves that kind of selection or election of students. If you're going to kind of connect this to your student representatives, if you have those in your universities. And that depends, how are your students selected or elected? And is that a process where you feel that it's often more vocal students, etc., that perhaps are involved? And there's a very nice example from a colleague I have at the University of Edinburgh who actually tried out a student representative lottery. So instead of students actually saying, I don't mind putting myself forward as a student representative, and maybe then there's 5 or 6 students who put themselves forward and then there's an election. Instead of doing that, I think there was a feeling that quite often in classes, students maybe feel a little bit pressured that they should put their hand up if nobody else is putting their hand up, but this kind of behavior. And so this colleague actually said, I'm going to run it as a lottery. So all of you are involved unless you've got a real reason why you don't want to do this. And then they do it as a lottery. Randomly, they pick out who the representatives are going to be. And what they were trying to do was basically involve students who might not otherwise put themselves forward. One of the interesting findings, they did this as a sort of pilot study, and one of the interesting things they found was that actually there are some students who want to kind of go into representation as almost a sort of part of their future career. And those students felt a little bit like they preferred the old system because they were more likely to be able to take a representative role, whereas the lottery was just open to whoever was randomly picked. So it was an interesting experiment, and I just think it plays with our ideas about which students should we choose or should we elect in different circumstances. Also, where you're only selecting 1 or 2 students, then there's also then questions around reward, recognition. Are we going to pay students? Do we give them course credit? Do we give them refreshments, vouchers? But that issue of recompense and rewards comes up far more with the idea of when we select students, and because it's often work that takes place outside of the classroom, so therefore it does feel like we should start to think about whether we're paying our students or not. And there's definitely significant benefits for selected elected students, as I've said, and I've already mentioned, I think we need to be very careful about not exacerbating existing inequalities, but not to sort of downplay. There is some brilliant work taking place in these kind of forms of co-creation. But let's think about co-creation in the curriculum. And this is where we're working together with a whole class of students. And so relationships are absolutely key to this, because in order to do co-creation at a class level, you need to build a good sense of trust, a good rapport, and positive relationships between the teacher and the students, and also between the students and the students. And often I think the relationship between the teacher and students leads to the kinds of relationships that students and students will then have. So not only does whole class co-creation need positive relationships, but by doing that kind of co-creation, it also enables and builds more positive relationships. So it's sort of, it's one of those positive feedback mechanisms in many senses. And we know that frequent and high quality student-instructor interactions are one of the most empirically supported educational best practices in higher education. And yet, this is something that I question myself and my colleagues, where we have programs of study for teacher colleagues, where we're sort of offering them support to do better teaching within the institution. I question whether we spend enough time focused on the importance of building good quality student-staff relationships. And so that it's a sort of challenge to myself as much as to, I hope this might resonate with some of you. So positive student-staff relationships, we know consistently that they're associated with better academic success for students, retention of students, better motivation, a stronger sense of academic self-concept, well-being, and students feeling they matter. So really, there's a lot of evidence of the positive outcomes, and the effects are especially beneficial for minority student groups. And I think that's really critical for us to be aware of if we're thinking about inclusion and about the achievement for minority student groups. And I've put in a little a bit of data there that suggests that 2/3 of students never use office hours. I don't know if office hours is something as common in continental Europe as we have in the UK, but this idea of having kind of an hour where the teacher says, that's an hour in the week where I will definitely be in my office. Come along and see me if you've got queries, etc. And a lot of people kind of see that as a way that they can make themselves approachable. But if we've got 2/3 of students that actually never use those office hours, there's a big group of students who are not maybe using that particular form of being able to make connection with their teachers. So we need to think more broadly than that. And I just think you might be interested in a number of different studies that are sort of showing us very interesting things about student-staff relationships. So one of them is a really fascinating study that came from Arizona State University. And Cooper et al. Did a study where they were working in a large, I think it was about 500 students in a large biology class. And they asked the students to put what they called name tents, with basically just a piece of paper folded over lengthwise, a little bit like you're in Brussels or whatever, and you've got your piece of paper with your name on in front of you. And this was in large lecture theatres. And the idea was that then the teacher was supposed to try and use the person's name, use the student's name if they were asking a question, or if they want to make any reference to something a student says, they can acknowledge them using their name. Variations of this have been done with large stickers on the back of laptops as well, so that if a student has a laptop open, that you can kind of read their name on the back of the laptop. And this was a fascinating study. They actually found that the teachers who did this were seen as more approachable by the students just for putting these name tents up and using those names. But I think one of the things that was really significant in this study is that the students said really clearly, we understand that you can't possibly remember 500 names. So they really get that. They're smart students. They understand somebody's not going to remember 500 names. But they said, we really appreciate that you are caring to try to know our names, so that you care enough about us that you think it's worth trying to use our names. So I know that's quite subtle, but to me, there's something powerful that reminds me of the engineering example of students saying, we love that you ask us about the assessment weighting. So it's a small thing. It's like the names. It's like, we really like that you try this, even though we know you might not remember everybody's names. It's meaningful to us. It shows us that you care. And I think that's quite powerful. So we know that the more contact between students and faculty, both inside and outside the classroom, the greater the student development and satisfaction. And I'm not advocating that all of us need to put in more hours at work, because I'm very aware that many people will feel really very, very busy. But I think it's about what we do when we are in the spaces of the university that we're in, whether that's when we're in the classroom, whether that's when we're walking through corridors. Do we say hello to students? This is about the way that we do things more than the kind of necessarily the time put into it. So I wanted to give you a couple of examples, and so I'm just going to share two small examples with you. So one of these is a woman called Rita Rillman from Wofford College in South Carolina. And forgive me, I've got quite a lot of US examples today. I should explained that I did a Fulbright scholarship a few years ago, and so have a little bit of a skew to knowing some of the US work. So forgive me that. But this is a really lovely example. And Rita Rillman was the only person at her college who'd been given an honorary degree. And when you look at why that is, she was the most mentioned person in exit interviews with students. And she basically is a member of canteen staff. And Rita Rillman basically was the sort of person who had a sort of what I would call a superpower. She remembered students' names and she remembered their stories, so that when they went to the canteen and they ordered their food, she would ask them things about, how is your mother who was sick last time I talked to you? She would remember the really important things for students, and it really mattered. And I think the real lesson for me of Rita Rillman is what we want is for all of our universities to be full of people like that. Not all of us will remember all names, but to make the effort to kind of show that we care for students and that they matter, because these are the building blocks of co-creation. We can't really move towards co-creation and partnership if we don't build good relationships and trust between people in our institutions. And the other example I wanted to give you was something where I ran a scheme called Coffee and Cake Conversations a few years ago, where we got a very modest amount of funding, and I asked for volunteers to go for free coffee and cake. And we gave basically a student volunteer and a staff volunteer, and I would pull them together from the same subject area. And then I would say to the student, you need to go and find 2 friends to bring with you, but you're all going to go for coffee and cake. And here's a voucher to go to the nice coffee shop where basically you can go and have a conversation. And we gave them a few prompts, questions to kind of get them started. So there were things like, what made you think about studying this subject? And for the teacher, what made you come into teaching this subject? We asked them about something like, have you had a good learning or teaching experience this semester that you'd be willing to share? Maybe is there something about yourself that people don't know that you're willing to share? So, and then we really said, answer as few or as many of these questions as you want to, but please just go and enjoy yourselves and have a coffee and have a chat. And actually, we were just really blown away by the impact of this small project, because consistently people emailed us and said, this was amazing. So they came back, and one group said, we don't need another voucher, but we're going again to the cafe next week because we had such a good conversation. We had a group of people who said, we found out we're all musicians and we're going to meet at a concert in due course, like that's coming up. And then I think the message that came through was we had a staff member who said, this reminded me why I came into teaching, because the students were smart, they were funny, they were just a pleasure to be with, and we don't take enough time to do that in the institution. And students who said, this was brilliant, I've never really realized what lecturers do in their time, because we see them when they lecture us, but we don't realize what else they do apart from that teaching. So it really was kind of phenomenal. And what we managed to do was build upon a lot of that motivation, that a number of schools actually implemented their own versions of this in the following years. So just little things that bring people together to create more space for conversations between staff and students. So in terms of, I'm just going to wrap up, but I think in terms of kind of co-creation, I'm arguing strongly that we really need to kind of start from relationships and build upon that. And that often in terms of, if you think of the examples that I've shared with you, and can we do this with a whole class? Sometimes I wonder, are we more held back by our own imaginations or assumptions than by other constraints? It's a really interesting provocation there from Breen and Littlejohn. Who've written that's a really lovely book actually, about kind of shared classroom interaction between staff and students. And so concluding really, I think I want to sort of suggest that conversations are different when students are involved. So sometimes it's worth us asking when we're in our university spaces, if there aren't students with us, how different would the conversations maybe be if we have students with us? This is all about doing learning and teaching and curriculum design with students, not to them. So it's a subtle shift, I think, in terms of how we work much more collaboratively. And I think dialogue and choice are first steps in this process. And having conversations with students and providing choice can be the sort of stepping off point. Building relationships and trust are absolutely key to this process. And I do think that there might be an argument here that whole class approaches can be more inclusive. It doesn't mean that you don't have to pay attention to inclusivity with a whole class. You absolutely do. But I think that it's an immediate step that can be taken that is more inclusive than when we select out students to work on particular projects. And I guess another provocation there to leave you with is, are we being negligent if we don't ensure that all students at some point in their university time experience some form of partnership or co-creation when we've seen some of the kind of transformatory outcomes that can come from co-creation and partnership? So I'm going to leave it there, and I've got some references here which will make sure that